This is the first and last president of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. In 2008, he will receive the Medal of Freedom from former US President George Bush Sr. for his contribution to the end of the Cold War. 2 years before USSR's collapse, Gorbachev will receive Nobel Peace Prize, and Time magazine will list Mikhail Sergeyevich in 100 most outstanding people of 20th century. But during his presidency in the Soviet Union, a country that once sent the first man into space, the standard of living was similar to that of Mexico or Chile, while in developed Western countries it was 2 or even 3 times greater. By the end of the 80s, individual republics began to break away from the former superpower, which recently occupied a 7th part of the world's landmass, and the ruling political elite completely lost control not only over the economy, but also over the entire country. How did it happen that the recent prosperity, which many still long for, turned into empty shelves for Soviet citizens in a few years? How did it happen that after showing an incredible economic rise in the 1930s, the Soviet Union also rapidly weakened and collapsed? In this video, we will talk about how the dream of a bright communist future collapsed in approximately 70 years, and the fatal mistakes that the Soviet leadership made. Prepare yourself for a concise tour of the history of a one-of-a-kind economic experiment. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics appeared on the world map in 1922. A new state emerged from the ruins of the Russian Empire, fenced country, where in 1917, 80% of the population were peasants living in villages. In fact, the Bolshevik Party, which promoted the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat, came to power in a peasant country where this very proletariat, simply put, the working class, had not yet formed. And in this difficult time in Europe, there is a literal sense of an impending conflict in the air. After the conclusion of the Treaty of Versailles, following the First World War, French Marshal Ferdinand Foch will say a prophetic phrase,
"Not peace, but ceasefire for 20 years."
The leadership of USSR understands that an agrarian country cannot withstand the upcoming war, and in order to catch up with Western countries in terms of living standards and create a powerful self-sufficient economy, the Bolsheviks begin a large-scale transfer of the peasant country to industrial rails. Here you have millions of peasants who need to be sent to work in factories and plants. However, you don't have factories. Most peasants are illiterate. According to the 1920 census, only a third of the population of the Soviet Union could read. Firstly, illiteracy is being eradicated in the country, enabling peasants to work at machines and read about the party's achievements and successes in building socialism in the newspaper after their day's work. The Goelro plan is being implemented throughout the Union in parallel. Electricity is being brought to cities and villages. Electric railways are being laid. The country is abandoning inefficient steam engines. However, the main goal of Goelro is not the Ilyich lamp in every peasant's house, but cheap energy for new factories.
В конце 20-х годов у Днепровских порогов началось строительство самой крупной в Европе гидроэлектростанции. Это были незабываемые годы первой пятилетки, о которых нельзя говорить без гордости и волнения.
By the start of the 1930s, 13 million, about 8% of the USSR's total population, had migrated from villages to cities. Meanwhile, the country's population increased, meaning that with a decrease in village workers, it was necessary to urgently increase agricultural labor productivity to feed the country. For this purpose, the Soviet Union's leadership starts collectivization, the initial and ultimately disastrous mistake. Look at the propaganda posters of Soviet collectivization. Almost each of them has something in common. Did you see? This is a symbol of the union of peasant lands from yesterday, tractor. In the late 1920s, the Soviet leadership realizes that mass supplies of raw materials to factories and food to cities can only be achieved by increasing agricultural productivity. To replace manual labor with machine labor is the most obvious way. However, the same tractor needs large areas for work, so forced collectivization starts in the 28th year, spreading throughout the country. Small peasant plots merged into collective farms with large plots of land where this tractor can operate effectively. Remember, I said that collectivization was one of the fatal mistakes? Why? Yes, because prosperous peasants, known as kulaks, were shot and sent to the gulag for decades during collectivization. Such hasty and thoughtless policy has destroyed the class of the most enterprising and successful workers in the village. And this will surely impact the Soviet economy. However, during the industrialization years, the Soviet Union made an incredible leap. By 1940, the USSR produced 9 times more industrial products than in 1913, and the national income during this time increased 6 times. Of course, it was the policy of industrialization that became a lifeline for the country during the Great Patriotic War. After 1945, the Soviet leadership has no intention of slowing down heavy industry growth. After all, a strong ideological and geopolitical rival emerges on the other side, prompting the Soviet Union to initiate an arms race for global dominance. Thus, machines, vehicles, and equipment for enterprises are still being produced rapidly. And all this is due to light industry, clothing, food, furniture, and other household human goods. Official Soviet statistics show this well. Pay attention to how the shares of these two industrial sectors changed in the economy of the USSR. However, the Soviet Union still lacks financial resources for the arms race after the devastating war, so the state purchases food from collective farms at minimal planned prices in order to save money. In a planned economy, you must sell the collected ton of grain to the state at an appointed price. Workers in the village practically earn nothing from these supplies. There are no incentives for hard work at such prices, so many live in poverty. Younger people are moving to cities. After the war, large construction projects are happening there where they get paid well. This is once again well confirmed by official Soviet statistics. By the year 61, the proportion of rural and urban population is equalized, although in 39, as many as 67% of Soviet citizens lived in the village.
Посмотрите, как из этих квартир инженер называет их объемными конструкциями. В Москве быстро монтируют дома.
And everything would be okay, but as it later turns out, the resources taken from the village in the 30s and 50s for industry growth were not spent efficiently. Starting from the 61st year, the Soviet Union purchased from capitalist countries 10 and sometimes 20 times more cars and equipment than it sold to them. And this doesn't mean the Soviet economy was so big it lacked its own machines and equipment, so they say it bought imported ones too. No. I remind you that the standard of living in the USSR was comparable to Mexico or Chile, while the US, Germany and France produced more goods and services than the Soviet economy. Nikolai Ryzhkov, head of USSR Council of Ministers in late 80s, will later write about this.
Our industrial goods were not competitive on the global market. Capitalists took only 6% of the total engineering export, while the majority went to the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance.
What caused this? In summary, it occurred because the Soviet planned economy lacked the presence of private initiative. All instructions on what to produce and in what quantities were issued from the top, from the State Planning Committee of the USSR. Essence of planned economy in dialogue between Gorbachev's assistant, Shakhnazarov, and Chief of General Staff Kromev in late 80s.
The official will ask why the USSR needs to produce so much.
Armed Marshal will answer like this because,
with great sacrifices, we've built top-notch factories comparable to those of the Americans. Do you instruct them to cease working and manufacturing pots?
Agree, it's difficult to argue with such rhetoric. In addition, most attempts by Soviet inventors to implement their know-how were hindered by endless bureaucracy and lack of proactive leaders. As a result of these factors, by the 1960s, the Soviet Union was heavily reliant on the import of foreign technologies. If before the Great Patriotic War all imported equipment, including licenses, was largely bought with money received from exporting food, then from the 70s, once an agrarian country not only reduces food supplies abroad, but also starts actively buying it itself. The Soviet leadership found itself in a vicious circle of its own mistakes. To produce more food, it is necessary to modernize agriculture, which has fewer and fewer workers. To modernize agriculture, technologies are needed, which must be bought in the West. But what to sell to the West to buy these technologies? Before we sold grain, but now we lack enough grain. That's why Khrushchev rushed to study selenium from the start of the 50s. There was hope that the untouched lands of Siberia and the Kazakh SSR would become huge arable areas and solve the agrarian problem through extensive methods. However, the climate in those regions is harsh and unpredictable, and the plowed steppe rapidly scatters, resulting in dust storms. Generally, developing virgin lands became ineffective and was rolled back. In 1962, the party's Central Committee, due to the lack of better solutions, finally raised prices for collective farms. This leads to inflation and a decline in real incomes of the population, which is why small rallies are erupting across the country. The biggest strike is in Novocherkassk. It's dispersed by the police, army, and the KGB. and the instigators of the protest are either shot or sent to camps for anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda. Recognizing the criticality, party leadership spends 1/3 of country's gold reserves in 1963 on purchase of imported food. In fact, Russia, which was the largest grain exporter in the world at the beginning of the 20th century, has become its main importer. It is evident that at this pace, Novocherkassk events may rapidly extend across the whole Soviet Union. But then, where did the currency come from to acquire imported equipment and food in the 1970s? And two remarkable occurrences took place that caused a delay in the imminent catastrophe. In the 60s, unique oil and gas deposits are discovered in western Siberia, and a little later, in the 70s, energy resource prices skyrocket worldwide due to crises in the Middle East. The Soviet Union benefits from a fortunate combination of circumstances and not only significantly increases oil and gas production, but also begins to export fuel abroad, filling its budget with side money. The government is becoming increasingly obvious. Why bother with troubled agriculture when there are huge oil and gas deposits in Siberia? It is better to extract resources from underground and make much more money, enough for both food procurement and assistance to communist regimes around the world, from Ethiopia to Vietnam. As a result, by the 80th year, food, along with cars and equipment, finally occupy the main share in Soviet imports, while oil and gas become the main commodity that is sold abroad. Huge amounts of money are being invested in the development of Soviet oil production. However, the deep problem did not go away, and in the mid-80s there was so much oil on the world markets that its price fell threefold. Unique Soviet deposits with cheap extraction began to run out. The flow of currency that could be used to buy advanced technologies has decreased because the USSR had nothing to offer capitalist economies except for cheapening oil. The turnover of foreign trade has slowed down significantly, and this meant only one thing. Now there will be a smaller amount of food purchased. And probably, even due to this critical situation, a way out would have been possible if the USSR leadership had not made mistakes in parallel. In 1979, the USSR invades Afghanistan, spending around 30 billion rubles on the war in Central Asia for 10 years. And in its 85, the party will launch a fight against drunkenness, which will only lead to the fact that in the following years, the already weak budget will lose about 10% of tax revenues from the sale of strong alcohol. And from this year, the Soviet budget becomes deficit. The state annually lacks tens of billions of rubles to finance growing problems. To cover budget deficit, State Bank of USSR starts printing money in huge volumes, which only increases inflation, and in conditions of non-market prices, to monstrous deficit. Sberbank of the USSR reports on the growth of deposits of the population, but it's all fiction. People replenish their savings books only because they cannot spend this money. Sugar, soap, and laundry detergent are vanishing from the shelves. People purchase everything just to eliminate depreciating rubles.
Берут все, что еще можно взять. Продукты, одежду, бензин. Все хотят купить хоть что-нибудь к празднику. Все хотят купить что-нибудь к подорожанию.
By the 90th year, only 11% of consumer goods out of a total of 989 types of goods remain freely available for sale. Throughout the country, strikes are starting due to product shortages.
Никак невозможно. За то, что шахтер идет в шахту, и ты целый день, целую смену голодный. Вот из-за чего началась забастовка.
People's belief in the ability of planned economy and Soviet leadership to provide a prosperous life has vanished. Letting prices float freely under the Soviet ideology was equivalent to political suicide. In 1986, the party decides to violate the main council of socialism. Initially, the government allows self-employment, later entrepreneurship, by adopting a law on cooperation. However, this exacerbated the situation. The emerging co-ops bought goods from enterprises at state prices and sold them at market prices. To serve the shadow private sector, thousands of banks were created, which in the absence of banking control institutions, turned into money laundering institutions. The severe economic crisis has put an end to further government loans. In Brazil, New Zealand and Norway, there were ships with meat products, powdered milk and vegetable oil ready for shipment to the USSR. But they never went anywhere because Soviet payments were billions of rubles overdue by the end of the 80s. Valentin Pavlov, USSR finance minister, preparing report on state of USSR budget in 1990.
The level of external debt has reached a point where it begins to increase without new loans. In 1990, almost all of the revenue from the export of fuel and energy complex products will have to be spent on debt and interest on it.
By now, foreign commercial banks no longer lend to the Soviet Union due to fear that these loans won't be repaid to them. The only thing that remains is to appeal directly to the governments of capitalist countries in order to obtain funds. We must dispel the conspiracy theory that the cursed capitalists destroyed the Soviet Union. Similar to Soviet leaders, the collapse of the USSR came as a total surprise to Western politicians. In 1982, when the Soviet economy was already bursting at the seams, a report from the CIA was presented to the US Congress which literally said the following. In the USSR, there is a steady decline in the pace of economic growth. However, in the foreseeable future, this growth will be maintained. In spite of the disparities that exist between economic plans and their implementation in the Soviet Union, the economic collapse of this country is not even a remote possibility at present. However, if previously negotiations between the West and the USSR were conducted on equal terms, by the end of the 80s the West was only willing to provide loans if the Soviet Union stopped using force to maintain its influence in Eastern Europe, as it was in Hungary in 1956 or in Czechoslovakia in 1968. But by 1990, the Soviet budget deficit had already reached 58 billion rubles. Not only assistance to foreign communist parties was at risk, but also payments of pensions, salaries of the army and navy, and the signal to the regional Soviet elites that the Soviet Union will not use force to resolve domestic political issues is absolutely clear. And soon in the Baltic states, Armenia, Georgia, Ukraine, and other republics of the Union, national movements are formed, which quickly gain popularity. And the policy of democratization and openness results in an upsurge in long-standing ethnic conflicts that have been ongoing for years. They flare up in almost all Union republics. By 1989, most of these republics initiated their withdrawal from the USSR. The parade of sovereignties begins. There is no longer any money or authority for the central government to retain the regions. Since the beginning of autumn 1991, the Union republics have been establishing customs posts on their borders with Russia, and regional taxes stopped coming to Moscow. The USSR Foreign Economic Bank declared bankrupt. No more money to pay for stay of ambassadors and representatives of Union abroad in country. By now, it's clear to the Soviet authorities that there's no talk of preserving the state. The sole task is to prevent a civil war in the former republics of the Union where the nuclear potential of the USSR is scattered. Perhaps this is one of the reasons why the Soviet Union collapsed relatively peacefully, at least compared to Yugoslavia. On December 25, 1991, the initial and final president of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, steps down. The next day, the history of the USSR came to an end.
Я покидаю свой пост с тревогой, но и с надеждой. С верой в вас, вашу мудрость и силу духа.
This is how the model of industrialization and planned economy chosen by the Soviet Union in the late 1920s led to the fact that a huge state was formed like a house of cards. After the USSR's collapse, the turbulent 90s started with free prices, privatization, and property redistribution.